2015, as Jim was saying, is clearly a very big year on the climate calendar, and a number of landmark meetings taking place, culminating, of course, with the COP21 in Paris at the end of the year. The UN Secretary General has called Paris a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to align climate and development agendas. Business participation is, of course, crucial. That's why we're here tonight. That's what we're talking about tonight. The UN has, for a while now, of course, been calling on business to lend its support, calling on the engagement of business. But just how well is that going? How engaged is business really? And how is that engagement evolving? I think these are questions we want to find out the answer to tonight. It's a question I put pretty much every year, or at least for the last 5 or 6 years, to the UN climate change people in Davos. And every year they put on a brave face and talk about progress in the face of adversity. They talk about moving in the right direction, et cetera, et cetera. And I was saying this to Mike beforehand, because I know he was in Davos this year as well. This year, I thought the message was a little bit more optimistic. Maybe it's to do with the momentum as we head towards Paris, but maybe things really are changing, and they see that business is really helping make a difference in this area. I want to, just before we start on the panel, play you a snippet of this January's interview I did with Christiana, who heads up UNFCCC. Here we go. Well, make of that what you will. I did sense a shift, though, I've got to say, especially speaking to her year after year and speaking to Connie Hedegaard as well. Maybe she's just fed up of me asking her the same question year after year. But I think a greater recognition from business of the opportunity or the opportunities of engagement was my biggest takeaway. Let's hear from the experts, though, hear it from the horse's mouths, if you like. As always, we're going to hear from our panelists individually for a few minutes, and then we're going to open it up into a panel discussion, and then I want to get you involved in that as well. So do prep your own questions. Mike Barry, to my left, is Director of Plan A, M&S's Sustainability Program. Mike has been one of the longest-standing voices on the need for companies to collaborate to tackle climate change. Very nice, by the way, to see you all here, and I'll introduce you as we go along. But Mike, let me start with Davos, with Christiana. I think it was your first Davos this year. Is it fair to say that there was a noticeable shift? Is it fair to pick out a little bit more optimism here? And is it because of the sort of coalitions that we're here to talk about tonight that we're seeing this optimism?
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw 4 things out in Davos that really made me enthusiastic for the future. The first was China, the world's biggest polluter, one of the countries that faces the world's biggest problems in terms of those impacts on its future development. And I saw a genuine shift in those that lead China, those that underpin its thinking, its science, its policy, thinking about how do they shift from the old hot way of growing the economy to a new, more sustainable system that is stable, not just economically, but socially. A genuine consideration about the low carbon opportunities. People listened to that. That was sort of step number 1. The second thing I saw was the way that the policymakers, the COP21 crew, reached out to business with a degree of mild panic, I thought. You know, there's a real sense that business is needed here to really help this thing, push this thing across the line. And why not? I mean, business drives some of the most significant contribution to climate change in the world. We are facing some of the most immediate impacts in terms of disruption of our supply chains from extreme weather events. We're facing the threat of divestment. We're facing the threat of some degree of consumer unease and concern out there. So business has to be part of this. But I thought policymakers were reaching out to business for the first time.
That's interesting. And I just want another quote from Christiana. She said the Paris Agreement needs to be relevant to business to get rapid and lasting results. Go tell your governments what needs to be in there to make this possible. For many, that's a sticking point because governments are not doing enough while a lot of the corporates are trying to push these issues. But you don't feel that. You feel there's been a shift from the policymakers too.
Absolutely. I think the policymakers traditionally have tried to keep business at arm's length from this, partly because they didn't want to let the fox into the hen house, because the loudest voice in this space in the past were the old fossil industry fighting to stop anything from happening. The sense that you can have a proactive business call for action on climate change was anathema. They didn't believe it could happen. Now, the last 2 or 3 years, absolute swing to the other extreme. Policymakers welcoming the positive voice of business into there to do two things. One is to actually come up with solutions. I think business is very good at practical solutions to drive change. And we'll talk about the Consumer Goods Forum in a little bit, about how it's starting to change the world's food industry. But the second thing is to create a mood music across global policymakers who are saying, OK, we accept climate change is happening, but let's just give up. There's no way we can change the old way of making money to a new way. And a lot of business leaders, they're putting their hands up and saying, we're entrepreneurs. We think there's a new way of doing things. It creates a very different mood music going into Paris to say, change is possible.
Well, I mean, how important, and your response, I think, is going to be obvious here, but how important is this collaboration between business? And I guess the second part to that question is, how much recognition is that collaboration getting from the policymakers?
Yeah. And again, I think what business has here is humility. You know, the world's biggest economies, China, the USA, grappling to work out how to change the world. Even somebody as big as Walmart or Apple, 25 times as big as M&S, are struggling to do it alone. This sense that we need to be together is growing. And again, we saw coming out of Davos initiatives like Collectively that's bringing businesses together, 32 big businesses, from Facebook to Twitter to Unilever to Coke, to engage tens of millions of millennial consumers in a new, fundamentally more sustainable approach to consumption. Yeah, yeah. So those alliances are forming.
And we'll talk about Collectively with Neil specifically in just a second. So strength in numbers. Strength in numbers to be able to be heard?
Well, I think the strength of numbers for two reasons. First, let me start with the practicality of changing how we do business. Those supply chains that drive the emissions, our carbon footprint. And again, what the Consumer Goods Forum has done, it brings the world's biggest food companies together, is mobilise real change in those supply chains. Palm oil, soya, the deforestation that's been caused traditionally by those industries. Now people like Unilever, Kraft, Coke, M&S are lining up to drive collective action. Even a Unilever buying a substantial amount of the world's palm oil for its margarine business cannot shift those producers on their own. Bringing people together sends that consistent buying signal.
The Consumer Good Forum, what do you do well that maybe some of the other coalitions are not doing so well that they could learn from you guys?
I think what has made the CGF's coalition unique is that it's bringing a traditional trade body together. What a lot of the world that we operate in, it brings together usual suspects. You'd expect Unilever, BT to be together there with IKEA working on climate change. What the Consumer Goods Forum does, it brings the world's food companies together. Some absolutely get climate change, for some it's a little bit more of a struggle, but absolutely they can move the dial together. And the key word for me there is scale. So they're focusing on two things. To tackle deforestation and low carbon refrigeration, they're the two most material impacts that food industry can make. We're not trying to do 22 things or 52 things together. Do two things together consistently across hundreds of companies across the world, and we'll make a real change.
All right, and just to finish up with, we're talking about a new generation of coalitions. We've already heard the sort of thing we're looking at here. Is this a starting point for you? How does this develop from here? Yeah. How different do these coalitions look 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Are we getting everything right?
No, we're not, because I think we're all just rushing into the room now. There's a degree of confusion. There's a few too many coalitions forming, tripping over each other. To me, there are three fundamental types of coalition. There's ones that cut across the economy that we can all sign up to, whether you're a pharmaceutical company, a car company, or a retailer. Tax on carbon, let's all just back it. It applies to all of us. There's other initiatives then, the second type, that's like the Consumer Goods Forum, that brings a sector together to drive fundamental change vertically down through its value chain. And then there's the third type, which is starting to focus in on specific issues like forestry. And I'm thinking now of the New York Declaration that was spun out of the World Economic Forum last January, that brings together many protagonists, government, civil society, businesses from many sectors, to tackle a really important material impact. And they're the three types that we need to be focusing on. I think we're a little indisciplined at this moment in time, rushing around trying to do too many things through too many different fora.
Interesting. It's the perfect introduction for our next guest, Mike. Mike, many thanks for that. Neil Dunn is Chief Sustainability Officer at BT. You've played a leading role, Neil, in establishing a number of these coalitions. And to Mike's point, a lot of things going on, maybe too many things going on. How do you control all of this? How do you stop it from getting out of control?
Well, I think the key is not to try and control it, not certainly in the authoritative way that we've done things in the past. I think once you begin to realize that control is about giving power back to the people, that mobilizing new constituents on this agenda, on climate specifically, is probably one of the greatest gifts that any corporation, that any leader can give the world. And I think that's the way Gandhi looked at the world, that's the way King looked at the world, and I think business leaders who are evolving their leadership style to become more purposeful and think about how they make a difference. You know, we saw Lee Scott after Hurricane Katrina really get acutely aware of his own legacy and what he wanted to do to shape and change the world. Paul Polman, Mark Boland, many others since then have really thought deeply about what this means to the type of business they want to lead. But I think what is becoming very evident, and Mike is just an absolute leader of this himself, is the importance of partnerships, of everybody going fast but going together. I would absolutely butcher the African proverb that talks about, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go a long way, go together. And the whole conundrum here is we need to go fast, but we need to go together. And maybe I think just what will also bring some focus to what will really work here is the headwind that we actually face. I mean, Mike is talking about, the systems level innovation that needs to happen horizontally and vertically. But there's a very sinister element at play here that is very involved with the existing machine. And I was talking to Jeff Sachs about 3 weeks ago. He reckons by his calculation that climate change denial in the run-up to the last US election was funded by about $450 million US dollars. Now, having come from my previous background in Saatchi, just simple maths remind me that's about 100,000 TV adverts that they're capable of churning out on climate change denial. Those same people have said they're going to double down on climate change denial in 2015. We simply can't match their resources, even with Coca-Cola, Unilever, Facebook, Microsoft, everybody saying, we're in. We need to be the SAS where they're the army. We need to be jiu-jitsu where they are.
Is there a worry anywhere, though, that well, I guess my question is, does this not need to be managed extremely carefully? And we mean business, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is an umbrella coalition, if you like. Is it fair to call it that? That maybe has a role also of managing what's going on.
Yeah, I think what it does is provide the air traffic control in around, kind of what can be a very congested area. And I think, to the point of being smarter, if we can actually line up all of the moves that we're capable of making through collectively, which is about, youth engagement at scale, helping their voices be heard and their actions be counted. Let's not forget that millennials are 1.8 billion strong, and they're probably the most purposeful population we have on the planet. So if they're mobilized in a way that they were on things like Coney 2012 or any of these other disruptive communications agendas, they can really be a force for good. And we mean business is really also looking at how we can give a voice to other CEOs, other business leaders who have not yet been part of the debate. Now, I think that the kind of the canary in the mine here will be when we've got an oil company in there, because it's the usual suspects at this moment in time. When we've got a Shell, when we've got somebody truly believing about going beyond petroleum and really committing their business to that as part of that coalition and able to substantiate it, I think that's the tipping point we all need to be trying to engineer and leading to achieve.
And maybe there is. I'll come on to this in a sec, because maybe there is a starting point for Shell to get into collectively, and we'll talk to Helen about that in just a sec. But again, and apologies I'm coming back to this idea of managing, this idea of keeping things in check. I spoke to Keith Weed on this stage about corporates as often seen as a barrier to engagement, especially in the 18 to 30s. I mean, is there a role for someone, maybe we mean business, to say, look, you need to step back a little bit from this?
Yeah, I think what we have to do is take our brands off the table and also realize that our brands have amazing convening power. So if you think about what BT could do on something like this, if we led this as a BT agenda, and this is about us, and this is about purposeful business from our perspective and the way we see the world, we'd fail miserably in the morning. Whereas if we thought about, well, now we're in sport, now we have access to amazing football players who are celebrities in their own right. We have access to the fans. We have access to the stadium. We have access to a whole other train set that wasn't part of our remit previously. Now, if we were to think about doing something that was properly bottom-up, fan and player-led, but convene and give that oxygen through the channel, give it prevalence, we could do something that would be, I think, us playing way to the left than we've ever played previously as a brand. Well, and all IKEA, M&S, others, all doing that in coordination, lined up and timed in the right way, would be hugely effective.
We'll come back to this when we have our discussion. Very quickly, do you fight with your CFO over any of these things?
Tony, I don't fight with Tony about anything. Tony and me are absolutely...
The whole decarbonising your business, because BT is clearly regarded as a leader.
I will tweet about that later. No, actually, interestingly enough, we do our power maps internally, and Mike and I talk about this quite. We map out the 50 most influential and powerful people in the business. The 3 people, and I'm proud to say this, that I might build my power base around is our CEO, our chairman, and our CFO. All
right, very good. Helen. Helen Wildsmith is head of ethical and responsible investment at CCLA and is leading the development of Aiming for A coalition. And we'll come on to Sainsbury's, onto Shell rather, in just a second. Let me start with this. Has the investor community, in your mind, been largely absent in creating a motivation in business to tackle climate change?
I think, like the business community, the investor community has been getting gradually more organised, gradually more vocal, gradually asking for even more. So initiatives like the Carbon Disclosure Project have been around for over a dozen years, now got 92 trillion of US dollars behind that, part of the We Mean Business coalition. So you're starting to see investors and businesses working together. About a dozen years ago as well, we started to see institutional investors in different regions coming together. Institutional Investors Group in Climate Change in Europe, they're all now cooperating with each other, working out what their policy asks are, turning up at the UN Secretary General Summit in New York.
They are still a pretty big barrier, though, the institutional investors, though, aren't they?
Well, part of the reason behind setting up Aiming for A was that quite often businesses can actually hear from fund managers and not actually from the ultimate owners of the businesses, the asset owners who give their money to fund managers to manage. So we realised that quite often the long-term investor voice can be absent at the table or feel absent, only there once or twice a year. So we realised if you got a coalition of asset owners and fund managers that are owned by their clients like CCLA together, perhaps you could amplify the voice of the long-term investor. So Aiming for A is a coalition of the 150 billion Local Authority Pension Fund Forum, the 15 billion Church Investors Group, and an increasing number of wealth managers representing very rich individuals. And we realised that if you could actually put supportive but stretching shareholder resolutions to companies' AGMs, then you could very publicly amplify that signal to business that, as we've been saying, we all need to work together. And Shell are publicly on record saying that policymakers, business and investors need to work together to tackle this challenge.
I found this great quote from Valerie Smith, Director of Corporate Sustainability at Citi, who I think quite recently announced a massive investment into renewables. Our clients are demanding it, our clients' clients are demanding it, our clients' investors are demanding it. I'm interested to hear the reasons companies, or the main reason companies are making the decisions they're making now in this space. What have you learned?
And I think you are right. There's a ripple all the way through the system. I would say that we manage money for churches and charities. We're hearing more from the trustees, who are hearing more from their stakeholders, who are hearing more from the young people campaigning outside. So you are getting that ripple effect. But I think what we need to do is find the mechanisms that allow people to collaborate, because the system keeps people stuck in various ways of thinking and investing. So quite often big business feels that big investors are asking them to do X, Y, and Z, whereas actually that may not be true if you get underneath all the signals. So for investors, if we end up in catastrophic climate change, that's very bad for all our portfolios. If we end up with a system where we have to have very quick, draconian, that's very bad for all our portfolios. So we all need to find a way of moving forward together.
Let me finish on this part, Helen, with the Shell piece. Why do you think Shell supported your resolution to explain how their business fits with this 2-degree pathway? Why do you think they did that? How transformative, I guess, is that decision? And could that mean, and we'll throw this around as well, that they could eventually become part of Collectively?
And it's also fair to say that BP have also accepted the shareholder resolution at board level as well. And it's partly that's how we designed the process. We wanted a supportive but stretching shareholder resolution. We wanted something that the board could see as supportive to them in this conundrum of the short term versus the long term. And of course, we as a coalition of asset owners worked very carefully on those resolutions, but we also tested those resolutions against some of the very biggest fund managers to see if they would vote for those resolutions. And a lot of them were signalling that they would, and therefore it's more sensible for everybody to work together, move to better disclosure, move to better discussions, rather than have a proxy battle this spring.
All right. Let me stop you there for now. Helen, many thanks. Trevor Hutchins is Director of Advocacy at the WWF. Well, let's just start with your reaction to something like that from Shell and BP. I mean, it's a big day, right, when something like that happens.
It is. I mean, this is very a first progressive step to really recognising and taking their heads out of the sand. Actually, this is a big global issue that they have a major part to play in resolving. If you listen to what the International Energy Agency is saying about 60 to 80% of known fossil fuel reserves having to remain in the ground, if your business relies on extracting those, you've got to wake up and look at what your model is going forward.
Is it fair to call the WWF one of these coalitions that we're talking about tonight? I mean, you are, I guess one of your goals is to bring business together to make sure they operate sustainably. Yeah, I mean, that makes you one of these coalitions, right?
Well, I mean, WWF is a huge global network of offices around the world that we have, and many of the characteristics of the coalition working are applicable to WWF, working very much across cultural boundaries, different country backgrounds that we operate in. So some of these sort of characteristics of working collectively are certainly something we're familiar with. And of course, we very much have a corporate partnership model where we do work very much with businesses to sort of look at their sustainability models and help them to become more sustainable in their business operation, to actually also to use their communication channels to also to portray some of our messaging as well. So with very much that partnership approach.
When you look at the different coalitions, and we'll talk more about them this evening, We Mean Business, RE100, Collectively, all of these. What for you works really well in terms of collaboration, and what doesn't work so well? I'm actually interested right now more in the latter. What doesn't work well?
Well, I mean, in the business partnerships that we enter into, clearly you've got to go on the grounds of openness and trust and a shared vision of what you want to achieve. You know, I think you've got to lay that out on the table first. And if you aren't sort of, on this journey together, and I think that's where you sort of you're laying the foundations of things going wrong later on in the in the process. I mean, we very much advocate a corporate stewardship model, so we're expecting businesses really to look at their operation, to look where they can work collectively together, because some of these challenges that we face are so huge and complicated and interconnected that no one organisation is going to make headway on its own. So working collectively together on that basis is really, really important. I mean, a great example where WWF has worked with over 100 organisations was on the recent review of the government's fourth carbon budget, where that was put at risk, and we worked collectively with businesses to really advocate for a clear message to government to say, actually, no, leave this alone. We don't want to undermine the business certainty that a clear framework that has been set. We want this to be, reviewed or not changed during the review, and working with businesses and other organisations was a real force for good in that example.
I'd be interested to hear your view of, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, and I apologise, but the head of WWF UK, David Nussbaum, wrote a piece recently that talked about David Cameron. And I guess he seemed slightly disappointed on the back of the big Arctic trip that you guys organised for him. I forget when that was, but that not enough has been done. And in fact, they've backpedaled to a large extent. Is that fair?
Well, given that my boss said that, it's certainly fair. Look, I mean, we facilitated a trip before the last general election, the greenest government ever, and I think it is fair to say that actually this government has done a number of big things. I mean, the UK has got more offshore wind deployed than any other country in the world. I think that's some major progress has been made. But of course, there are going to be areas where actually, we want to see more, and the whole, green tariffs on bills was an example where that wasn't the government at its best. We want to see more progress made on energy efficiency in particular. So, there's some good progress, but there are clearly some areas that need to do better.
Have you ever felt more optimistic?
I think 2015 is a huge year. We've got the climate deal at the end. We've also, before then, got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are going to set a 15-year framework for overseas development investment, trillions of dollars, of which will include climate change commitments and energy commitments. And so I think if we can pull those two together off this year, that is going to set a framework. But I think it's be clear that the Paris deal should not be seen as that's the end game. Yeah. Actually, this is an important step on the process. And so, yes, of course, we want to see good progress made there, but it's a longer-term thing that we need to ensure that we don't put all our eggs in one basket and find actually we've got some disappointment, where in fact, actually, it will be a step along the way.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Trevor.